So welcome everyone to our latest uses webinar. I'm Alex Fields. I'm a third-year law student at Columbia Law School. I'm on the uses steering committee. I'll be working with solar and wind projects primarily after graduation. And so for today's webinar, we're going to be looking at what it takes for New York State to really ramp up its solar generation to the levels that it needs to address New York's very ambitious energy targets, as well as to provide inexpensive, abundant, and reliable electricity. And so our speaker today is Dr. Richard Perez. He's at SUNY Albany, and he is the Director of Atmospheric Sciences Research Center there. He is also one of our technical advisors for uses. He's foremost expert on solar issues. And with that, I'll let you take the floor, Richard. And before we start, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And also the webinar recording and slides will be available after this webinar. So with that, Richard, floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can see my screen. First, a quick correction. I'm Richard Perez, but I'm not the director of the Atmospheric Science program at University at Albany. I'm a senior research associate at the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center. So the title of this presentation is Big Solar in New York, Just the Facts, Powering Almost Everything Without Breaking the Bank and Preserving Landscapes. I would like to acknowledge some of my co-authors from Clean Power Research and Pace University, University of Rome and URAC, who helped me develop some of the figures I'm going to present today. And the plan of the presentation is first why we need big solar, how you do it, is there enough sun to do it, what when the sun doesn't shine, is it cheap enough? Then we'll focus on New York and look at powering just almost everything, the electric sector, as well as electrified transportation and building sectors, and where to deploy while not paving the state over with giant PV farms. And finally, how it happens. Is that more technology question or a policy question? So why first? We have a problem, a climate problem that is slowly but surely overwhelming us. But one of the good quote unquote aspects about it is that 90% of that problem is traceable to energy production and consumption. So if we resolve the energy question, we'll probably tackle the problem as well. So it's good to take a look at energy, and let's take a very high level global view of it. Let's look at the way we use energy around the world. The planet uses about 19 terawatt years of energy per year under all forms, transportation, industry, electricity, you name it, everything. That's what the planet uses all the time. It's terawatt year is trillions of kilowatt hours. And currently the economies of the world power that consumption with the four big ones: coal, petroleum, natural gas, and uranium. So these resources are finite, and someday we'll run out of them, and it will get eventually more and more expensive to tap into them if we don't destroy the earth before by keeping using them. But there are only maybe 80 to 100 years available from those. Then we have renewable potential, and these are per year. So wind is a very large potential, could actually power the planet several times over. You have others like wave energy, which is probably too small. Ocean thermal energy technology, probably not big enough either. Biomass, it's disappointingly small. Even if we stopped growing crops for food, we would not produce enough fuel for powering the planet. Hydropower is quite limited by the numbers of rivers. Geothermal also, only a few spots can exploit technologies we have today. And tidal power is minuscule. And then you have the solar potential. And when you look at it this way, it doesn't even compare. Solar is orders of magnitude in terms of potential, bigger than everything else. So when people talk to me about a basket, and we should not put all the eggs into a basket, diversify the resources, for me, it doesn't resonate, because solar is so much bigger and has been powering the planet for millions of years, and there is tons of it. So let's make the case for it today. So between solar and possibly wind, we have a big solution. And the instrument of that solution for the solar part is photovoltaic electricity production. One of the interesting aspects of solving the energy problem is that major sectors that use fuel today can be electrified, the buildings and terrestrial transportation, definitely. So is it big enough? Yes, very likely. Is it cheap enough? Solar PV is rapidly becoming the least expensive technology to generate electricity on a pure kilowatt hour basis. That's from Fortune magazine. This is the price of a photovoltaic module since I get started. So it went down by a factor of 50. And my friends in the industry tell me that a couple of years from now, we can expect top of the line PV modules below a dime a watt. That's the Lazard Bank report from the latest one that actually looks not at the cost of modules, but at the cost of produced megawatt hours. And utility scale solar is now almost on par with utility scale wind, and measurably cheaper than conventional generation, including combined cycle natural gas. So we have a big solution. It's also prospectively a cheap solution. But what when the sun doesn't shine? Because when I look at compare those prices on the bottom right here, it's not a fair comparison for sure. Natural gas is dispatchable and can be firm power generation, whereas solar and wind live at the whim of the weather and the seasons. So it's not quite the same. So let's look at that more in detail. That's the output of a solar collector on a given day. So nothing at night, and then it ramps up, then clouds come in. So it is what I call intermittent. Some other people prefer the term variable. Intermittent means sometimes it's on, sometimes it's off, and that characterizes what solar is. But what we need if we want to grow solar is something that's firm and dispatchable. So as a result of that intermittency, solar occupies a marginal position and needs to sit on top of dispatchable, controllable generation to operate, and doesn't acquire a grid dominant position. It would have to be transformed to be dispatchable to do that. And my opinion is that intermittent marginal position is at the root of some of the opposition that occurs, that is growing in the country between grid operators and the solar industry, because new plants are built online and someone has to manage that variability. And that's what happens inside the day. It's an intraday issue that's probably easily resolvable with a bit of storage. The much bigger problem is a seasonal and multi-day problem. When you have weeks of cloudy weather in a row in a low yield season, you have to do something. So solar would have been to be transformed in something that's available without fail, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 365 days a year if we want to acquire a grid dominant position and be able to replace this type of generation into solar and wind, which are both viable. So how do you transform an intermittent resource like solar into something that's firm, dispatchable, 24/7, 365? Well, energy storage is on everybody's lips. And it does work. When you have excess, you put it into storage. When you don't have enough, you take it out of storage. You smooth variability with it. There is one major issue with it, whereas unconstrained kilowatt hours from solar is very cheap, see the Lazard report, making it firm 24/7 will cost a little fortune with storage only, because we will need so much of it. And that's even using the cheapest cost projection I could find for 30 years in the future with storage, because we'd have so many holes to fill in the off-season time. So that sounds pretty much hopeless unless you think just a little bit outside the box and you overbuild the solar resource, and by design you curtail it, you throw away some of the output by design. You don't try to concern everything that's being produced. And when you do that, something very interesting happens. So the white line represents the LCOE of the firm kilowatt hour. The red line is the contribution of solar, and the blue line is the contribution of storage. So the solar contribution goes up because you overbuild and waste, throw away some of the power, but the blue line goes way, way, way down. It doesn't go to zero. You always need storage, because storage is the glue that gets through the night and when you don't have production. But you can reduce so much that you get to a point that's pretty attractive and can make you think, hey, maybe we can do it big time and be dispatchable 24/7. In fact, that overbuild and curtailment is so effective that we started calling it implicit storage, because it acts as a catalyst to storage. It enables storage to do what it does, but at a much, much lower cost. And we've backed that up with major visibility studies. We just completed, Clean Power Research did a study from the mid-continent system operators, where an optimum mix of dominated by PV could yield firm generation costs below 5 cents per kilowatt hour in 2040. We looked at several subtropical grids in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean, and 100% solar solution also could be done at very low costs. And my colleagues in Italy have looked at the Italian grid and came to very similar conclusions. The thing is that the solution that would get us there is not monetizable today. It's developers are not empowered to overbuild and throw away half of their production. It doesn't work that way. So we're kind of stuck on an expensive marginal road when we could direct ourselves to a low cost and grid dominant future. So obviously what needs to change has less to do with technology than regulation and policy. And the thing that most effective thing that could be done, in my opinion, is that to start monetizing firm kilowatt hours and evolving away from unconstrained kilowatt hours as we have today. So when you monetize firm kilowatt hour, you embed the storage, overbuild, and curtailment, the enablers of firm power generation, into the economic system that's being bid. And that could happen under the form of firm dispatchable power purchase agreements. And we would have to evolve from the thing that remunerates every single kilowatt hours today, the standard PPAs, the value of distributed energy resource, and the net metering. And I must say, I've been using net metering for close to 25 years already, since it got legal to do so in New York, and I've taken full advantage of it, but didn't necessarily help the grid to generate firm power generation from my system. So if we do that, we can look to a future that's both fully dispatchable and not very expensive at all. These are numbers that came from our MISO study, the Mid-Continent System Operator, which is a very large grid operating service that runs from Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Canada. We looked at every single region of that grid, and region 7 is not very much different, at least climatically, from New York. It's Michigan part. And in that part, the optimum solution is about 55% PV, 40% wind, and 5% that we kept of legacy natural gas, with an optimum PV overbuild of 50%. and that yields 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour by 2040, and 2050 would be 3.7 cents per kilowatt hour for firm power generation. So not run-of-the-mill PV, but firm, available 24/7. If you're interested, you can go into that study that's been published by the Minnesota Solar Pathways at this web address. So let's look at New York with that same scenario, 55% PV, 40% wind, 50% overbuild. And let's look at a case when we would power just about everything in New York, all the electric system, the transportation sector, which would have been electrified, and also the heating part of buildings that would have been electrified. And the question, and let's look at where we can deploy all the PV to meet that load, especially since we are going to overbuild everything by 50%, that has to occupy some space. So let's look at the demand side. How much do we have to supply? So quick look at the US as a whole first. This is the electrical demand of the US in terawatt hours. This is the terrestrial transportation once electrified. In fuel terms, it's quite a bit higher than that, but electric engines are quite a bit more efficient. So that would be what would be needed by a fully electrified transportation sector. And that's what the building and residential commercial building sector would require after being electrified. Also, there would be a reduction from current primary energy consumption because of the coefficient of performance of the heat pump systems that would be used to electrify the heating load of those buildings. Total, it's still a staggering number, 7,100 terawatt hours. That's the New York chunk. It's a good part of it. And you will notice that the building sector is proportionally bigger in New York, just because we have more pronounced winters than the average of the country. So it's quite a big load. So let's see on the supply side how much PV would be needed to do that job. We did the exercise. Given New York's climate and New York resource, it would take 189 gigawatts of PV to do everything around the clock without fail. So that's about 30 times more than our current plans of deployment in the state. And that would require a space of 360 square miles. So if you take it out of context, it's a huge number. Imagine a 360 square miles solar farm with no one in sight. It looks gigantic, but we'll put it in perspective and in context. First, to put it in perspective, imagine that corn ethanol today in the US occupies 50,000 square miles. 100 of those are in New York State. And we're not even sure whether corn ethanol as a positive produces more energy than it uses in production of it. So for New York, 365 square miles is about the size of that little yellow part in the question mark that you see. And we look at how can we deploy that from two standpoints. One is looking at a ground occupancy standpoint, and another one is looking at end-use activity standpoint. So ground occupancy first, that's the ground occupancy of New York State. So the state is dominated by forest by far, then come the farmlands, wetlands, and then suburban and urban areas, open water, and some open land. And we did a scenario, and I'll talk later about how that scenario can be adjusted at will, where we would occupy a fraction of that land cover, 15% of urban space that amounts to a little less than the building stock and parking lots. So 5% of the suburban sprawl space, 5% of open water, taking advantage of floating PV on artificial reservoirs. We've published extensively about it a couple of years ago. And then 1% of farmland, not a lot, a tiny amount of it. And that alone leads us to 650 50 square miles, so much more than needed to do the job. And also to put it in perspective, let's remember that what we call forest today, if we look 120 years ago, it was farmland that have been abandoned since then when farmers moved out west. So it would not be unthinkable to take a little bit of that back to produce clean energy. That's what 650 square miles represent with respect to the forest stock. So there is probably much more than 650 square miles that could be tapped to produce PV. Another way to look at it is to use that end-use activity and see where we can deploy PV without functional modification. So the first thing we looked at is roof space, building envelopes, and you have commercial deployment on the right, industrial as well, residential. There is a lot for the taking in the States. And for me, a city is like a giant prospective solar collector. And it amounts, if you use 50% of that space only, it leads 185 square miles of development for solar development. Another big one is power lines right of way. So I have a big power line next to me where I go to work just about every day since confinement. So that space is huge in the States. The right of way, if utilized at 75%, would yield 161 square miles of development land of PV that's not being used today, and that has to be kept low to protect the wires above. Gas pipeline right of way, the same thing, but a bit less space, 21 square miles. Then you have railroads right of way, about 21 square miles in the States. You have expressways right of way, and here in that study that we are going to publish, we only looked at the center lane, which may be easier to do than other parts. And we use center lanes already for energy, as we see in Albany, as we well know. This is petroleum transiting on a center lane of 787 in Albany. That would yield about 12 square miles for the state. This one may be a little bit far-fetched, but not maybe so. It's called Vehicle Integrated PV, VIPV. All the major manufacturers on the planet are looking at it more and more seriously, where you use the outside of a car as electricity production facility. There is a lot of envelopes to be used, especially in the semi-truck. So those things could provide power for the transportation sector directly when it's rolling, to the utility at large when it's connected to the grid through their battery system. The real estate, amazingly, for all the cars and trucks in New York State amounts to 21 square miles. Then you have landfills and industrial mining exclusion zones. In fact, we looked only at mining and landfills for that study. That leads almost 30 square miles. And you have parking lots. Those occupy about 24 square miles, and they're already being tapped for solar deployment today. So that list is probably exhaustive. There are probably many other sectors that could be tapped into, but just that is 475 square miles. And I didn't count things which have a big potential that would require a minor modification of function as opposed to no modification of function, agrivoltaic, farming solar, and floating PV on reservoirs, which is a fast growing field of photovoltaics. Plus maybe tapping a little bit in that forest stock by possibly extending the size of the right-of-ways for PV generation. Might not be all that far-fetched. So we probably have quite a bit more than we need as well. So whichever way we look at it, either from a ground occupancy or an end-use activity standpoint, there is plenty of room to grow, especially since PV will be higher efficiency in the coming years. People are talking 30% with the advent of new technologies. We also have demand-side energy efficiency built in the CPA in New York to lower demand. So that number may not be as big to begin with. We may need less gigawatts covering less space. But even then, even taking things as is, it's not fully unthinkable that we could almost consider 100% PV to power everything. So how does it happen? Technology or policy? So in my opinion, policy is front and center in the decisions that need to happen, the shift that need to happen. The first thing, as we said earlier, is to monetize firm power instead of unconstrained power as we have today. And the second thing is to change from a case-by-case approach to deploying PV, like on houses, on businesses, and every which way, to more of an intelligent, concerted, optimized way of saying these are the good spaces to deploy. This is where we're going to do it, and let's plan it right and big from the onset. And if we do those things, the monetizing firm power will probably ease the tensions that have been growing up between utilities and solar industry. And with a good plan on where to deploy, that will also likely ease the tension that have been building up slowly between communities and solar industry developers. So here you have the main actors. Technology will follow. Technology is here. It exists to do the job already. It can only get better. It will get better and cheaper, but we don't need any breakthrough on that front. What we need a breakthrough is to get those actors to think alike. And if they communicate, then we can really take hold of that big solution. If we don't, we may get stuck on a marginal solar world. Many countries have been through that. Take the case of Germany. Germany used to have the fastest, healthiest solar industry on the planet for many, many years, until they reached a point where that intermittent production on the German grid really stunted that growth, and now it's not growing anymore. They didn't move to the next level, which is let's transform PV into a 24/7 resource that can power everything. So before I close up, I'll give you a heads up on that publication that we're in process of finishing, should be done before the end of the year. The title will be Ultra High PV Penetration, Where to Deploy. So that exercise that I showed in New York, we did for every single state. And in addition to the publication, it will point to an interactive website where planners in every single state could actually do the type of scenarios that I showed here for New York. What if I deploy so much on that type of soil? So there will be a website empowering user to do that in every single state. That could almost be pushed to the county level if we have the opportunity in the future. Wow. And on these good words, I will thank you for your attention and hand the screen back to our host.
Thank you, Richard. That was a terrific presentation. And sorry, one second.
I think you're muted, Alexander.
Oh, can you hear me now? Oh. Okay, I think if everyone can hear me, just wanted to thank Dr. Perez for his terrific presentation. I think everyone can hear me. Oh. And so with that, we're going to go through some of the question and answers. So the first question is, this was near the start of the presentation about the size of solar and its potential. We have a comment that someone thought this was really interesting about solar potential and other forms of renewables, and is contradicted with information in the book Drawdown. There, it lists land-based wind as the number 2 solution for drawing down carbon, and all 3 sources of solar, being concentrated, large-scale, and rooftop, are a bit further down the rankings, 8, 10, and 12, or something like that. Can you talk about this potential discrepancy about where other observers like in this book haven't thought solar has big potential as opposed to your research, which shows the enormous potential of solar?
I don't know what to say. I would have to read that study and critique it if I didn't see it. But I think all you have to do is sit down for a minute and look at the numbers, and they speak for themselves. They're just in your face. It's just that people, for the longest time, when I built my first solar system on my home a long time ago, people tell me there is no sun in New York. And there is tons of sun in New York. There is only 30% less than in Arizona. Just people see the cloud and they think the thing doesn't work, but it's a giant resource. If you think about it, it powers everything, like daylight outside. Imagine how much petroleum it would take just to light up the outside. It would be zillions of crude carriers spanning the ocean nonstop just to do that. It's a giant resource. Just look at the numbers.
I definitely agree with that. The next question is, this was in response to your overbuild scenario more generally, and how New York State could achieve this. But if New York State decided to go for this approach, roughly how long would it take to practically implement a 100% renewable solution?
I'd say the goals of New York State are, our climate plan is 2040. I think it's not unthinkable to do it by that time. The world production of PV today is fast approaching 200 gigawatts per year. So we're talking 200 gigawatts in New York. So it's not unreasonable. It's within what can be done. And that world production of 200 gigawatt today has been growing 100-fold in the last 15 years. So projected 15 years from now, it's going to be 2,000 gigawatts. So I think if we set our mind to it, it can happen for sure.
Terrific. And the next question is, can the New York distribution grid handle the distributed generation through solar fields for this much solar, as you're talking about in your overbuild scenario?
That's a fantastic question. And in fact, that's a question we posed when we did the MISO study, which has a very large extent geographically and has a giant grid to transfer power from one to the next. And what we found out is that if you interconnect the entire MISO, it's a little bit cheaper, but not much cheaper than having smaller interconnection zones. So when you have big solar, you could almost consider it as being localized, as opposed to needing a huge transmission to go from one place to the other. That's one side of the coin. The other thing is that once you transform solar generation into effectively dispatchable, firm power generation, it becomes almost functionally equivalent to the type of generation we have today, and that the grid takes care of that generation, no problem. And I don't see any fundamental change of the transmission to accomplish the same thing with firmed up solar.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how you're conceptualizing as solar can really be tailored for distributed generation, even at this large state. The next question is, how much does the development of solar capacity as a sum of hundreds or thousands of small rooftop installation versus a small number of large installations affect the final cost per kilowatt hour? The number of negotiated legal contracts and billable lawyer hours per megawatt hour alone would be huge.
All right, so the billable lawyers hours, I will leave that up to you. But I'll contextualize first. If instead of doing it piecemeal like we do today, I'm one person and I'm going to do my roof, I'm one person, I'm going to do my developing system. If it's planned as it's not one roof, it's thousands of roofs that are the equivalent of a dispersed PV power plant, an integrated power plant, and everything is done at once, then you can have one lawyer for 1,000 systems to engineer everything as opposed to having a piecemeal step-by-step effort. So that's what I say in the second point that we need a plan, and that plan includes deploying the resource as smartly as possible, which means integrating all those individual systems into virtual power plants.
I think very interesting to reconceptualize how that. The next question is, so I'm actually going to group two questions together. First, and these pertain to storage. The first is there any risk with current solar panel and battery storage technology? And on storage, how do you store solar in the winter when we have very little solar potential?
Okay, so I'm going to do the first part first, the risk. So I'm looking at a battery in my basement here that I've had for also several years. Every one of us has batteries in our pockets from our cell phones, same technology, and the risk is extremely low. The usefulness, I think, exceeds the risk by a factor of millions. The PVs themselves have no risk at all, and it's silicon technology, and I mean, it's like glass as far as I understand. The second part is the huge quantities of storage for winter and how do you do that. So this is the point I tried to make in the presentation. If you overbuild optimally the solar resource, you will not need huge quantities of storage. You will need, I think in the best case, in the Michigan part of the study, we had about 20 hours worth of storage. And that's it. That's all you need. You don't need seasonal storage. You don't need huge quantities of batteries. That's the beauty of implicit storage, which is you overbuild by design and you throw away some of the output. And when you do that, the equation shows you that you don't need all that much storage. You will need it through the night, but that's about it. So no worries about winter. If you design the system right, you will go 365 days a year with reasonable amounts of storage.
The next question is, maybe this, I don't know if within your expertise, but who are the key policy people in New York State one would approach for transformation?
Could you repeat that?
So, sorry, who are the key policy people in New York State one would approach to spur this transformation?
Well, you tell me I've been trying to reach them all my life, but I somehow was never successful enough. So I think there are people in power that can actually make things happen in the state or at the federal level, and those are the people that need to be convinced of the soundness of that solution. I'd be happy to talk to them if I can. So far, it's been I've not been 100% successful at that.
Mm-hmm. And just for clarification, after we finish the Q&A, I'll be briefly talking about sort of the updates to regulatory landscape for citing renewables such as solar in New York. So we'll get to a little bit of this in more detail. The next question is, are there any studies you know of comparing the lost economic output of agriculture replaced with solar farms?
No. I'm sure there are many studies, but I must say I've not gone through those in details. I know Germany has tons of solar farming and farmers take full advantage of it, so they must see their worth into that. So you see, when you drive through Germany, you see fields of wheat, field of corn, and you see greens, and then you see fields of PV from that same farm, and the farmers do pretty well with it.
I think definitely interesting thing to look into in the future, especially considering weather.
And they blend very beautifully in the landscape too. It's not an eyesore by any means.
The next question is from someone, we're looking to put a solar farm down at our waste treatment facility. Where do we begin?
Maybe that's conversation we should have offline. I'm specialist of big picture as opposed to step by step. I'm sure that I would first talk to a solo developer, because they've done that exercise times and times over, so they could take you by the hand to do the job. That's what we did when we changed the system on our house. I began by calling a company, and they took care of just about everything for us. All I had to do is write the right amount check at the end. But so I would say begin with talking to one of the many developers in New York State.
That's definitely good practical advice. There's the next question is about someone who wants to learn more about the idea of overbuild and curtailment because it's new to them. Can you point that to a good resource of paper? I think that obviously the work that you've done is on point on this, but if you could just repeat it for everyone, just so we all know.
Yes, I have many of those papers are posted on my website. If you Google Richard Perez Solar, that will bring you to the papers we've published on the subject. There is also the Minnesota's. If you Google MISO high penetration solar, it will probably take you to the study we just completed in Minnesota. That's probably the most recent, the most complete study, Minnesota Solar Pathways.
I think definitely good for everyone to check out after this webinar to learn more. The next question is pertaining to your model. What is the percent overbuild of solar?
So in New York, we assumed a number that worked well in the Michigan part of the MISO study, which is about 50%. So you build 50% more than you need, and you throw away 33% of the output by design. You just don't monetize it, it's gone. It looks pretty crazy that why should I lose 30% of my prospective income, but somehow it works out that it's the cheapest solution by far if you want to generate power around the clock. People who have built a remote PV system have known that for years. If you design a PV system for remote disconnected island, you're going to overbuild because you have no other source of power. So you only have battery and solar. If you want not to pay a fortune in battery, you know that you have to oversize. So same thing happens when you try to devise a system large scale for a continent. So overbuild is the key. And then that opens the door. That energy that's thrown away, that's curtailed, is essentially free because it's curtailed, and some smart people could do something with it. I'm sure that when there is free energy somewhere for the taking, people will do something with it. So people are inventive.
Yes, and I think that's definitely, the key optimism here, and sort of related to thinking about the overbuild. In your research, you're modeling, seeing how a number of different states, other jurisdictions were doing this, but are there states or jurisdictions specifically that have conducted or plan to conduct demonstrations or pilots to reveal the performance of the the overbuild strategy that you've described?
Not that one per se. We've done paper studies. A big one, that MISO study, was financed by the DOE. The Italian study and the Caribbean island studies we did were financed by the European community. So they were well-endowed projects. No demonstration yet. However, the industry already is starting to move into an overbuild direction. Maybe not the optimum overbuild thing that I've mentioned today, but it's called inverter limited overbuild, where you build a smaller inverter than your PV system can produce, and the output during the day is flatter. So you get more hour of full power. In my view, that's just a first step in the right direction, but not the optimized step. We've also proposed pathways to get us there, where you can start by overbuilding very slightly and optimally instead of delivering firm power as an end game 24/7, you start by delivering what you forecast for the next day, which would already be a big help for the grid operator. You ensure, in fact, what you're going to produce tomorrow and the day after. And that can happen not with 50% overbuild, but with only a couple percent overbuild. You can optimize that. So we just published a major paper on that subject, taking NISO, in fact, as a case study. I'll be happy to distribute that paper. It's not yet on our website, but if people are interested, just contact me and I'll forward you that link to the paper.
Yeah, I think it's very great to see how these solutions can be practically implemented here in New York State. The next question is, no matter how much you overbuild, you may not have any solar in the winter in New York State, but there may still be plenty of solar in the Southwest, referring to, I believe, the Southwestern United States. Why not bring solar from the Southwest via HVDC that has only 10 to 15% power losses over the 3,000 kilometer distance?
Okay, well, two answers, because that question is really to the first thing. The person who formulated the question say, no matter how much you overbuild, there will never be enough in winter. That is factually not correct. The numbers I presented for New York are all resource within New York. If you overbuild 50%, you still need battery in winter, but you can minimize their size to the point where it doesn't break the bank. So it works within a state. In fact, we started by looking at transferring power from the West Coast, crisscrossing the US, in fact, crisscrossing the Atlantic, taking advantage of Sahara and all that. But we soon realized that first, the legal prospect of building HVDC lines were putting people making people angry to put the transmission system on steroids to do that. Although it may be a little bit cheaper at the end of the day, was not much cheaper at all. The beauty about overbuild is that you can really do it locally, even if we have strong winters like New York. So even a county could do that. In fact, we've calculated in that paper I just was mentioning, the difference between doing 100% solution at the county level versus doing it as a state level. So you have geographic transmission involved between the two. There is a 5% bottom line cost difference. So it's not a make or break thing. You could really do it down to county level if you really wanted to, being very resilient that way.
Yeah, I think those are very good points to keep in mind, both the potential for allowing that local distribution of solar, but also underscoring that farther transmission may have its own set of issues, which a little bit separate from this conversation. And I know we're running a little bit up on time, but I think a good question to close out is, at a local level, the biggest challenge we have to deal with large-scale solar are neighbors concerned about change. What advice do you have to win over these folks whose biggest concern is the change to their neighborhood?
Yes, change is always difficult, and people are apprehensive about it, but change can be transformationally good. So one thing I would tell the person who asked the question is that first, we can already deploy PV where no change would be perceptible, like all the roofs, you don't notice it. You really have to climb on the roof to see it. Power line right of way, I mean, what change would you see? You would see power line is there, you just use the space there. I've been driving extensively through Europe, Germany and Italy, where solar farms are the norm of the day, and their landscapes can be stunning, with blue fields of PV intermixed with yellow fields of wheat, and it looks really nice. It doesn't need to be ugly. It could be ugly. I mean, I've seen ugly systems out there, but they can be made to look very elegant. So, yeah, change is always frightful, but I'd rather see blue fields here and there feeding in the landscape rather than having to to move precipitously from my digs in New York City because the water would be too high.
Yes, I think that's very good framing of it. Where, with big solar, it doesn't necessarily need to be a conflict. That even if, it seems like those are really big inhibitors right now, that there are ways to overcome that. So, Dr. Perez, thank you again for your terrific presentation and question and answers. For those of you whose questions we did not have time to get to, we're going to try to go through them and perhaps provide some answers as well. We'll let you all know with that. And with our final 8 minutes or so, I just want to give some updates about, what the regulatory landscape is looking like for big solar projects and some developments there. So let me know when you can all see my screen.
Yeah, all good.
All right, so here we have a brief introduction to Section 94C regulations, which are passed recently. Your first question might be, what is Section 94C? So this is a new section of New York's executive law to overhaul the siting process for large-scale renewable energy projects. So ones that are defined as greater than 20 megawatts, which includes solar. And what 94C does, it creates a new centralized uniform permitting regime for these projects to be administered. And that'll be done by the Office of Renewable Energy Siting that was created within the New York Department of State. So if you're thinking about, from one of the questions I was asked before, who are the key players in the state with this, ORIS, they're definitely one of them. And what this law does is, or supposed to do, is that it significantly streamlines the permitting process compared to Article 10, which is the existing regime for how projects like solar get sited. And it also establishes set timeframes for when the different stages of this process have to be completed. And they're also, under this new law, provides developers are supposed to provide host community benefits to the communities where they'll be sited. And so one of our previous webinar from April 29th actually went into this law in really great depth. I'd encourage you to rewatch it if you haven't already. It's by Daniel Spitzer, who's an attorney who practices in this area extensively. And he discusses, 94C, other provisions enacted by this law here that put 94C into place. So that was back in earlier this year when Section 94C was passed. But now, what are the regulations? So these sort of call out more of the details as to how will this law be actually implemented. So to do that, on September 16th, a few weeks ago, ORIS issued draft regulations and uniform standards and permitting conditions. So saying, what the regulations are for the different areas, but also the standards and conditions that developers will need to comply with for their projects. And they were developed in consultation with a number of different New York State agencies and entities. So what these cover is that, first, the draft regulations cover procedures and studies across the different parts of the permitting process that developers have to comply with. Additionally, the uniform standards and permitting conditions, these are standardized measures that try to minimize or mitigate potential adverse environmental impacts from when they're constructing or operating projects. So measures that developers will have to take that should remain consistent when they're building and actually operating the projects. So some of the examples of areas, sort of environmental impacts that developers will have to consider and have considered around agricultural resources, setbacks, visual impacts, impacts to endangered species, and wetlands. And there are some solar specific measures in there as well, given that the Section 94C law and regulations pertain to renewables more generally. There is some stuff that's specific to solar in there. So what's coming next? Now that ORIS has released these regulations, they're trying to seek public comments as they're initially developing these standards and conditions, because right now they're in draft form. And so there's going to be 5 public hearings across the state, as well as 2 virtual public hearings that are going to be held online. So here are the dates and rough locations of them. We're going to include, be sure to post a slide so you'll be able to have this information. But also, in addition to the hearings, ORIS, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, has encouraged all stakeholders in the public to submit comments. So, and there's 2 deadlines to be aware of. The first is that comments on the draft regulations. So thinking about the procedures and studies in the permitting process, those are due on Monday, November 16th. Conversely, you have comments on these uniform standards and permitting conditions. So those being the ones about the potential adverse environmental impacts, those are due on Sunday, December 6th. And there's a lot more detailed information about where exactly the hearings will be held, as well as how to submit comments on ORIS's website. So it's oris.ny.gov/regulations. Again, we're going to be sure to send this out to everyone. And finally, we've only really scratched the surface about what these regulations mean. So to go into this in a lot more detail, we're going to have we'll be having an upcoming panel discussion that really takes an in-depth look as to what these draft regulations and permitting conditions entail. And it's going to be at the Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Workshop, held Monday, November 16th, 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. It's going to be 2 experts in the area, moderated by one of our steering committee members. And I think it'll be really enlightening about that. And additionally, one last action item is that our colleagues at New Yorkers for Clean Power have a petition for ORIS to finalize the 94C regulations as soon as possible. So we can send that around to you all as well if you're interested in looking into what they're trying to do, and as well as feel strongly about making sure that these regulations are finalized soon. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining this webinar. I want to thank Dr. Perez again for his terrific presentation and question and answers. And we hope you'll join us again soon and keep in touch with all of our latest developments. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye.